She is remembered as the radiant child at the center of Las Meninas, a girl whose golden curls, solemn gaze, and velvety dress captured the imagination of centuries. But the portrait that immortalized her glow also hid the slow collapse happening inside her fragile body. Margaret Theresa of Spain was born into a dynasty already breaking beneath the weight of its own blood. Admired for her beauty, yet weakened by generations of close kin marriage, she grew up cherished, sheltered, and slowly drained by a lineage that demanded heirs her body could never safely carry. At 21, after 6 pregnancies in 6 years, she died in childbirth, an empress undone not by politics or betrayal, but by the impossible burden of sustaining an empire whose blood had turned against itself. Her story is not one of royal triumph. It is the story of a young girl sacrificed to a dying dynasty. Margaret Theresa of Spain entered the world in the spring of 1651 as the long-awaited daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his niece, Queen Mariana of Austria, a union forged not out of affection but out of a dynastic instinct to protect what remained of Habsburg power. Her birth was celebrated throughout the court, for she represented both renewal and continuity at a time when Spain was already limping under the weight of wars, losses, and the slow decay of an empire stretched far beyond what its fading strength could support. Yet from the earliest days of her life, it became painfully clear that the child Spain celebrated was not built to withstand the burdens placed upon her. Those who cared for her in the royal nursery noted how often she cried from fevers that rose without warning, how her joints swelled and stiffened after the smallest exertion, and how her appetite came and went in uncertain waves. While the court rejoiced that she looked charming and angelic, with pale skin and soft curls inherited from generations of royal intermarriage, her nurses whispered that her beauty was fragile in a way they could not quite name. Margaret Theresa's earliest months were marked by an unsettling pattern. Sudden illnesses followed by incomplete recoveries. Periods of apparent strength followed by exhaustion so deep she could barely be roused from sleep. The physicians of the Spanish court, limited by 17th-century knowledge yet painfully aware of the dynasty's medical history, described her as delicate, prone to imbalance, and constitutionally challenged, a phrase they often used for children of close-kin unions. Her father, King Philip IV, adored her deeply, perhaps more than any other child he had fathered, and visited the nursery often to watch her play. But even he noticed how quickly she tired, how she had to be carried after only a few steps, and how her breathing grew uneven under the weight of the elaborate gowns tradition required her to wear. Velázquez, who painted her repeatedly during her childhood, captured only the outward brilliance the court so desperately wanted the world to see. In Las Meninas, she stands at the center of the canvas like a small sun, illuminating everyone around her. Yet even as the brush immortalized her innocence and glow, those closest to her knew that the artist painted only a fraction of the truth. Behind closed doors, the young princess often struggled simply to endure the daily rituals of royal life. Court ladies recalled how, after long sessions of being dressed, posed, and instructed in etiquette, she would sink into a chair whispering that her head felt heavy or her chest tight. Sometimes she fainted outright, prompting the household to remove layers of silk and stiff brocade that restricted her already shallow breathing. Her physical delays became harder to ignore as she grew. She walked later than most children of her age and moved with a stiffness that worried the royal physicians. Her growth was slow, her posture fragile, and her stamina nearly non-existent. When other children ran through the palace corridors, laughing and shrieking in the kind of wild joy common to any childhood, Margaret Theresa watched from a cushioned bench, her hands folded calmly, her face composed in a way that seemed almost unnatural for someone of her age. There was intelligence in her eyes, a quickness of understanding that impressed her tutors, but her body refused to mirror the liveliness of her mind. Visitors to the Spanish court often commented on her ethereal appearance, a doll of ivory. One ambassador wrote, yet almost all of them privately noted that she looked more breakable than regal. Even the pomp of royal festivities, which should have dazzled a child, appeared to overwhelm her. At banquets she ate little, picking at her food with a fatigue that alarmed her attendants. At ceremonies, she stood only briefly before needing support. Her mother, Queen Mariana, a stern and deeply conservative woman, insisted that the child fulfill as many duties as her rank demanded. But when Margaret Theresa's legs trembled during formal appearances, even she had to concede that the girl's health was not of the robust sort. The Habsburg court, for all its splendor, was a place where illness was constantly present, yet rarely spoken of, especially when it touched the royal children. But in Margaret Theresa's case, silence could not conceal the reality. Her blood carried the genetic consequences of generations of intermarriage, weakened immunity, vulnerabilities to infection, and a constitution easily exhausted by physical or emotional strain. Though few in the court understood the precise biological reasons, they sensed instinctively that she was a child marked by the dynasty's long shadow. Every fever she endured lingered too long. Every winter brought new bouts of coughing. Every physician's visit concluded with a variation of the same warning: she must be protected, guarded, and spared undue strain. Yet, tragically, the very family that sought to preserve her also imprisoned her within a world that demanded more of her than she could ever offer. From the moment she was born, Margaret Theresa was not simply a daughter. She was a symbol, an asset, a vessel for alliances and future heirs. She was raised gently, yes, but not freely. Every decision around her childhood, her diet, her tutors, her schedule, even her playtime, was guided by the understanding that she would one day serve the dynasty. And as she grew, the contrast between what the court expected and what her body could withstand widened into a quiet, aching tension that defined her life long before she was old enough to understand it. To the world, she appeared luminous, the golden center of a fading empire. To those who lived beside her, she was a fragile child, already carrying the cracks of her lineage. And beneath it all, Margaret Theresa herself learned, much too early, that her body was not hers to protect, but hers to endure. Margaret Theresa grew up in the vast and echoing corridors of the Royal Alcázar of Madrid, a palace that was both a symbol of imperial glory and a monument to the exhaustion that had settled over Spain by the mid-17th century. The world into which she was born was no longer the Spain of conquest and gold-laden galleons, but a kingdom staggering under the weight of its own past victories. By the time she learned to walk, the empire that had once stretched across continents was visibly fraying, drained by endless wars, broken finances, famine, and outbreaks of plague that left entire regions hollowed out. Even within the controlled environment of the court, the signs of decline were impossible to ignore. Corridors patrolled by fewer servants, tapestries faded by time, and whispered conversations about losses in Catalonia, Portugal, and the Netherlands drifting like smoke through palace rooms. For a child as observant as Margaret Theresa, the atmosphere seeped into her earliest memories. She sensed it in her father's face, lined with the strain of ruling a realm, collapsing under its own inertia. She sensed it in her mother's rigid posture and constant vigilance, as though the entire weight of the dynasty hung from a thread she alone was trying desperately to hold. The palace women who looked after her carried themselves with the solemnity of people who lived through too many deaths and disappointments. Even her toys, miniature furniture, ornate dolls, gilded carriages seemed like relics from a world that no longer believed in its own magnificence. The Spanish court, for all its formality, thrummed with a quiet anxiety that children often notice more acutely than adults realize. Margaret Theresa learned early that silence was safer than questions, that joy had to be carefully measured, and that even small transgressions might disturb the brittle composure of those around her. When she played among the maids of honor and dwarfs who attended her, she did so within an atmosphere permeated by unspoken fears. Fears of political assassination, of military defeat, of a succession crisis, of the monarchy itself slowly disintegrating. Her father, Philip IV, loved her deeply. Yet he was a weary king, one who had buried his male heirs, watched rebellions spread, and presided over the diminishing relevance of a once dominant empire. When he visited her rooms, he often carried an air of melancholy that she, even as a child, found impossible to ignore. She would tug at his hand, asking him to stay, sensing his sadness even if she could not understand its origins. But kings, especially kings of failing empires, are not permitted to rest, and his visits were always too brief, too burdened, too full of unspoken dread. Her mother, Queen Mariana, was colder, confined by religious discipline and the weight of her own responsibilities. She loved her daughter fiercely, but expressed it through control, instruction, and endless reminders of duty. Margaret Theresa grew up under the stern teachings of a woman who believed that obedience, piety, and sacrifice were the only shields left for a family beset by political enemies and internal decay. Under her mother's watchful gaze, the young princess learned to curtsy perfectly, to speak softly, to carry herself with the dignity expected of someone who would one day serve as the linchpin of a dynasty. But she also learned fear of disappointing her mother, fear of showing weakness, fear of acknowledging the frailty that tightened around her body like an invisible corset. Even her schooling reflected the anxieties of a kingdom in freefall. Her tutors instructed her not only in languages, music, and religious devotion, but in the unspoken understanding that she must, someday, secure the dynasty through marriage. Every lesson she absorbed, every prayer whispered, every instrument practiced, every hour spent learning the elaborate etiquette of the Habsburg courts carried within it the shadow of future obligation. She was a child raised not for herself, but for the survival of an empire. Yet she was not without moments of tenderness. Among her attendants were individuals who adored her, who tried to shield her from the harsher realities of court life, who told her stories to make her laugh and offered small comforts during her frequent illnesses. The maids of honor, often only a few years older, treated her like a shared younger sister, fussing over her when she grew pale or tired. The court dwarfs, figures relegated to amusement in crueler households, found in her a gentle companion who listened to their stories and treated them with unexpected kindness. These pockets of warmth softened her childhood, but could not protect her entirely from the realities around her. The Alcázar itself contributed to the sense of melancholy that shaped her youth. Its labyrinth of rooms held centuries of history, much of it tragic. Fires had scarred its walls. Plagues had swept through its chambers. Mourners had walked its halls too many times to count. Margaret Theresa grew up in a world where portraits of ancestors lined every room, their pale faces and protruding Habsburg jaws serving as constant reminders of her lineage's burdens. As she matured, she became acutely aware of the quiet desperation that hovered over the court. Economic hardship forced even the palace to reduce spending. Diplomatic failures eroded its influence, and news of battlefield defeats reached Madrid with numbing regularity. The grandeur of Spain still existed, but it was a grandeur performed rather than lived, maintained through ceremony rather than strength. Margaret Theresa, despite her youth, absorbed the tension like a sponge. She learned to smile softly during official appearances, even when she felt faint. She learned to hold her breath when courtiers argued in hushed tones over the future of the empire. She learned to keep her own fears tucked neatly behind folded hands and lowered eyelashes. And in the midst of all this, she grew into a symbol, radiant, cherished, and unbearably fragile. A living reminder of what the Habsburgs had been, and a quiet warning of what they were becoming. The world around her was unraveling, and she, delicate and luminous as she appeared, could feel the threads slipping through her fingers long before her life began to collapse, for reasons far more intimate and more devastating. As Margaret Theresa entered adolescence, the gentle illusions of childhood dissolved, and the political architecture of her life began to reveal itself with chilling clarity. The courtiers who once delighted in her presence spoke increasingly in careful tones about alliances, inheritance, and the survival of the dynasty. The whispers, once about her health or her beauty, shifted to discussions of marriage, an unsettling reminder that her body, fragile as it was not hers to protect but hers to offer. And from the moment the topic arose, the name that surfaced again and again was one she already knew intimately: Leopold, her uncle, the future Emperor Leopold I of Austria. For most young girls, marriage is a distant idea, something imagined through fairy tales or whispered stories among companions. But for Margaret Theresa, marriage was a political inevitability decided not by affection or desire but by calculations made in dimly lit council chambers. The Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family had drifted apart through war, famine, and political misfortune, and the only thread capable of sewing them back together was her. The court expected her to serve as the bridge, the living symbol of unity, the vessel through which a dying bloodline might continue. The irony, cruel and unmistakable, was that the very bloodline she was meant to preserve was already exacting its price upon her body. The Habsburg chin, the respiratory weakness, the recurrent fevers. These were not isolated ailments. They were symptoms of a dynasty collapsing from within. Yet rather than step away from the practice that had weakened them, the Habsburgs doubled down. They believed purity equaled power, and so they prepared the fragile girl for a marriage that would intertwine their genes even further. Margaret Theresa had known Leopold since childhood. He was much older, soft-spoken, devout, and shaped by years of imperial training. She thought of him as Tio, a familial presence rather than a romantic possibility. When she first heard his name spoken in connection with her future, she reportedly cried, insisting that she did not want to marry someone she viewed as an uncle. But a princess's tears were no match for political necessity, and the court, after offering gentle consolations, quickly returned to its negotiations. The pressure intensified with each passing year. When she turned 13, her mother began instructing her more directly about duty, sacrifice, and destiny. Margaret Theresa listened obediently, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but inside her chest anxiety swelled like a silent tide. She felt trapped between her mother's stern will and the unspoken understanding that refusal was impossible. Her tutors shifted their lessons to include Austrian customs, preparing her for a land she had never seen, a language she barely spoke, and a court far stricter and more demanding than the one in Madrid. The palace began to dress her for her future role. Her gowns became heavier, her jewelry more symbolic, her public appearances more orchestrated. Everything she did, how she walked, how she smiled, how she held her fan, was evaluated through the lens of how she would represent Spain once she crossed the borders to Austria. But while the court polished her image, her body continued to stagger under the strain of expectation. She suffered a severe fever at 14, an illness that left her bedridden for weeks and caused many to fear she would not recover. But recover she did, though weaker, paler, and even more breathless than before. It was a cruel twist of fate. Every illness made her more vulnerable, yet every recovery brought her closer to the marriage that would demand more of her than she could give. When the official betrothal was announced, the court celebrated with grand festivities. But beneath the music and wine lay an unmistakable undertone of relief. Her marriage would secure alliances, reinforce claims, and stabilize a dynasty clinging to its last threads of relevance. Margaret Theresa herself felt none of the triumph. She attended the events with practiced poise, bowing her head gracefully and offering polite smiles, but her eyes carried a quiet dread that only her closest attendants noticed. They whispered among themselves, wondering how a girl so delicate could endure the demands of imperial motherhood, yet none dared speak their fears aloud. In the months leading to her departure, the Alcázar transformed into a place of lessons and farewells. Her mother reminded her constantly of the responsibility she bore, emphasizing that the future of both branches of the Habsburgs rested on her shoulders. Her father, though more tender, could offer no comfort either. He too understood the weight of dynastic survival and knew that sentiment had no place in decisions of state. The courtiers around her spoke of honor, duty, and glory. But Margaret Theresa understood that the language of duty was often just a more polished way of describing sacrifice. On the day she left Spain, at 15, the palace was filled with ritual and spectacle. She wore a gown heavy enough to exhaust even the strongest woman, her hair arranged in a style meant to reflect both Spanish tradition and Austrian expectation. As she walked down the long stone halls, attendants trailing behind her, she felt the enormity of the moment not as triumph but as loss. She was leaving her home, her childhood, her fragile safety, and stepping into a future designed not for her happiness, but for the needs of a faltering empire. The people who watched her depart saw a princess, luminous and dignified, but within her chest beat the terrified heart of a girl who had never been allowed to choose her own path. She boarded the carriage that would take her to Austria, carrying with her the quiet sorrow of someone who understood, far too young, that she had been born to fulfill a purpose that would ultimately break her. When Margaret Theresa arrived in Vienna at the age of 15, she stepped into a world colder, sharper, and more ceremonial than the one she had left behind in Madrid. The Austrian court, steeped in rigid protocol and shaped by centuries of imperial austerity, moved with a formality that made even the somber Spanish court seem warm by comparison. And yet, within this formidable environment, stood a man whose affection for her was genuine. Leopold I, the uncle she had once feared marrying, who greeted her not with triumph or entitlement, but with a kind of gentle relief that startled everyone who witnessed it. Leopold, awkward in manner but sincere in feeling, adored her from the beginning. He wrote poems for her, arranged music and small operatic performances designed to lift her spirits, and often visited her private chambers simply to ask if she was comfortable, if she needed anything, if the foreign halls of Vienna felt less strange that day than the day before. Their relationship, for all its unnatural origins, contained an unexpected tenderness. Courtiers recorded that the emperor would look at her with a softness seldom seen in him, as if he believed that careful devotion could compensate for the destiny she had been forced into. But affection, no matter how sincere, could not shield Margaret Theresa from the strain of her new life. The journey to Austria had already weakened her, and Vienna's winter air, sharp as a blade and unrelenting in its chill, gnawed at her lungs. The palaces she moved through were vast and drafty, their marble floors cold against her already fragile bones. Court ceremonies demanded long hours of standing, bowing, and bearing the weight of heavy gowns and intricate jewelry. Every public appearance required discipline, posture, poise, and the ability to hide, behind powdered cheeks and stiff brocade, the physical collapse, always threatening to reveal itself. Within weeks of her arrival, it became clear that the shift in climate and customs was taking a toll. She suffered from constant fatigue, a breathlessness that forced her to pause repeatedly when climbing stairs, and bouts of dizziness that caused attendants to hold her steady during long audiences. Margaret Theresa tried, valiantly, to adapt. She learned German phrases, practiced Austrian etiquette, and attended state events beside Leopold with the composure of someone far older than her years. But her body was less cooperative. She found herself waking each morning with a heaviness in her limbs that no amount of rest could lift. The fevers, which had plagued her since childhood, returned more frequently, accompanied by chills that left her trembling beneath layers of blankets. Leopold noticed, and though he never scolded her or pressed her beyond her limits, he could not shield her from the expectations of the court. Like all royal marriages, theirs was meant to produce heirs children strong enough to inherit the empire, to stabilize succession, to restore a sense of future to a dynasty haunted by fragility. Every advisor, every diplomat, every priest spoke to them in the language of responsibility and divine obligation. And Margaret Theresa, raised from birth to obey, internalized these pressures with a quiet, tragic acceptance. At private dinners, she often tried to reassure Leopold that she was willing to do her duty, but her voice, soft and breathless, carried an unmistakable exhaustion. He would reach across the table, brushing her hand gently, urging her to rest more, attend fewer ceremonies, and avoid the winter winds that swept through Vienna like ghosts from the mountains. But even he, with all his affection, could not loosen the iron grip of dynastic expectation. The Habsburgs needed heirs, and Margaret Theresa, delicate, trembling, and barely recovered from one illness before another began, was expected to provide them. The palace doctors expressed concern. They noted her weak pulse, her shallow breathing, the pale, bluish tint that sometimes touched her lips after exertion. Several recommended that she limit her physical activity and avoid stress, but their warnings, though earnest, had little influence on the machinery of empire. Margaret Theresa continued to attend audiences, council meetings, religious ceremonies, and formal events because tradition demanded it. Every time she tried to quietly excuse herself due to fatigue, attendants reminded her gently, apologetically, that an empress must be seen, must embody strength even when she possessed none. Yet through all this, Leopold remained devoted. He sat beside her during long evenings when she was too ill to rise from bed. He read to her from books he thought might comfort her. He canceled his own obligations when her fevers rose too high, pacing outside her chamber with the worry of a husband, not an emperor. When she felt well enough to sit at the harpsichord, he listened as though every note she played was a fragile miracle. Still, affection could only soften the edges of a truth too harsh to escape. Her body was slowly crumbling beneath the combined weight of illness, environment, and duty. The courtiers loved to speak of her beauty, her luminous skin, her gentle expression, her golden hair that glowed under candlelight, but they rarely acknowledged the fragility that threaded through every gesture she made. She moved like someone conserving energy, choosing carefully each step, each smile, each movement of her fan, as though her strength were a resource she had to ration. Vienna admired her, but Vienna also consumed her. The imperial crown she wore was ceremonial, but the burden behind it was real, and with every passing month her health frayed a little more. She was a beloved bride, yes, but she was also a young woman dying slowly in a world that saw her first as an empress and only second as a human being. And within her chambers, behind closed doors, she felt her life narrowing into a cycle of exhaustion and recovery, devotion and duty, affection and inevitable decline. Leopold's tenderness gave her moments of peace, but even love could not rewrite a reality that had been written into her blood long before she took her first breath. Margaret Theresa had barely settled into her new life in Vienna when the court announced, with triumphant relief, that she was pregnant. She was 16, still more girl than woman, still struggling to breathe in the Austrian winters, still learning how to carry the crushing weight of ceremony. Yet the empire greeted the news as though a great victory had been won. Diplomatic letters flew across Europe. Celebratory masses were ordered. Advisors whispered about renewed alliances and strengthened succession. For a brief moment, the Habsburgs felt their future brighten. But inside the empress's private chambers, reality looked different. Pregnancy settled onto her body not as blessing but as burden. Morning sickness brought her to her knees. Fevers returned in waves. Her pulse fluttered unpredictably. She often fainted while dressing, overwhelmed by the effort of standing beneath embroidered fabrics and pearls. Servants found her pale and trembling after ceremonies, her breathing shallow, her hands cold. Even short walks across the palace left her dizzy. Those closest to her whispered that she looked as though the life was being drawn out of her rather than growing within her. When her first child arrived, frail, sickly, and destined not to live long, it was as though her body understood, more clearly than any physician, that she was not meant to survive motherhood. The court responded with solemn acceptance. Babies died often in the 17th century, especially Habsburg babies. But the sorrow carved itself deeply into Margaret Theresa. She mourned not only the child she lost, but the strength she had sacrificed to bring it into the world. And yet, before she had recovered, the cycle began again. Pregnancy followed pregnancy with a rhythm as relentless as the ticking of a clock. The empire demanded heirs, and Margaret Theresa, exhausted and obedient, gave everything she had again and again and again. 6 pregnancies in 6 years. 6 times her already fragile heart was forced to beat harder, faster, beyond its natural limits. 6 times her breath grew thinner until she felt as though she were living inside a shrinking cage. Her body was breaking. After her second pregnancy, she developed chronic infections that the physicians treated with purges, tinctures, and bloodletting procedures that only weakened her further. Her limbs swelled painfully, especially in the final months, so that she could barely walk without assistance. Her joints stiffened. She complained constantly of a heaviness in her chest, a sense that her ribs were too tight for her lungs. Her hair thinned, her voice grew soft and hoarse. She sometimes slept for 14 hours, yet woke with less strength than when she lay down. Servants noticed how she moved her hands to her abdomen when she thought no one was watching, not in tenderness but in fear. They overheard her begging her confessor for strength, for mercy, for her mother's presence, for breath. Twice she collapsed on the stairs. Once she fainted in front of the entire court during a celebration marking her husband's military victory. The imperial physicians began speaking more urgently behind closed doors, whispering that her constitution could not withstand another pregnancy, that her heart was weakening, that she might not survive another labor. But the court, bound by politics, ambition, and the brutal logic of dynastic continuity, did not listen. She was empress of the Holy Roman Empire. Producing heirs was her sacred duty, and so the machinery of expectation ground on, indifferent to the suffering of the girl at its center. By her fourth pregnancy, Margaret Theresa was too weak to climb the palace stairs and was carried by attendants. She often fell asleep during council dinners or sat through them without speaking, her gaze unfocused, as though she were drifting somewhere between pain and exhaustion. Leopold noticed and excused her when he could, but even he, gentle as he was, could not refuse the demands of his advisors. The empire needed a son. His love for her, genuine as it was, lived in constant conflict with the monarchy he had sworn to uphold. Her fifth pregnancy nearly killed her. She developed a respiratory infection that left her coughing blood into linen cloths embroidered with imperial crests. Her fever burned for days. Her doctors debated whether the unborn child should be sacrificed to save her, but such actions were forbidden by both canon law and imperial tradition. She endured the illness silently, clinging to consciousness, her fingers gripping the bedsheets as if sheer will could force her body to endure what it was never built for. Afterward, she was a shadow of herself. She moved slowly, limping slightly from months of swelling. Her cheeks hollowed, her eyes dimmed. Even candlelight seemed too bright for her, but still the cycle repeated. Duty did not pause for grief or weakness. The sixth pregnancy, her last, was visibly killing her from the beginning. She could barely stand during the early months. Every physician warned the emperor that she was in mortal danger. Leopold, torn between love and responsibility, begged her privately to rest, to withdraw from public life, to protect herself. But Margaret Theresa, raised from birth to obey, believed she had no choice. She told him quietly that she wanted to be a good empress, a good wife, a good daughter of Spain. She told him she wanted to do what the dynasty asked, even if she feared she would not survive it, and she was right. Her sixth pregnancy pushed her body to its breaking point. Her lungs weakened, her heart strained. Her skin grew translucent, as though the life within her was hollowing her out from the inside. Every step hurt. Every breath was a negotiation. Every day was stolen time. By the time she entered labor, her attendants already sensed that she would not survive. She had given everything. Too much. Far beyond what a fragile girl, molded by politics and broken by duty, could ever endure. By the time winter loosened its grip on Vienna in early 1673, Margaret Theresa's body was already perilously close to collapse. Her sixth pregnancy, forced upon a frame that had never fully recovered from the previous 5, transformed her from a fragile young empress into something closer to a ghost wandering the palace corridors. She moved slowly, supported by attendants on either side, her breath shallow, her skin tinged with a pale translucence that alarmed even those accustomed to her lifelong delicacy. Every physician who examined her delivered the same verdict in increasingly urgent tones. Her heart could not endure the strain. Her lungs were barely functioning. Her constitution was failing. Yet no intervention existed in the 17th century to save a woman who had been pushed so far beyond her limits. Still, Margaret Theresa faced the final months of her pregnancy with a kind of resigned composure, as if she understood that the path laid before her had been carved long before her birth. She prayed often, whispering to God for strength, for forgiveness, for the hope, however faint, that the child she carried might live, even if she did not. She wrote short, trembling notes to Leopold, apologizing for her weakness, assuring him she wanted to do her duty even if she feared the outcome. Her attendants found her crying silently some evenings, her hands pressed to her abdomen, her tears falling onto the embroidered sheets that bore the imperial crest. When labor began on the 12th of March, 1673, a heavy stillness settled over the palace. Those who rushed to her chambers recognized immediately that this would not be an ordinary birth. She had been feverish for days, her pulse irregular, her breathing labored. Even before the first pains gripped her, she was already dangerously weak. The empress was carried to her birthing bed, a heavy structure draped in crimson fabric, symbolizing imperial life, but also, ominously, the blood that would soon be spilled. Midwives lit candles, priests gathered outside the room, and physicians positioned themselves nearby with basins, linens, and instruments that could do little more than witness what was coming. The labor was long, unendurably long. Hours passed, then more hours. The windows darkened, then brightened with dawn, then dimmed again with the coming evening. Margaret Theresa drifted in and out of consciousness. Her breaths came in small, ragged bursts, as if she were drowning on dry land. Her hands clenched the sheets until her knuckles turned white. At one point she whispered for her mother, a plea that pierced even the most hardened members of the court. At another, she begged the midwives to let her rest, unaware that resting meant slipping closer to death. The physicians attempted to intervene, compresses, tinctures, whispered prayers, but nothing eased the agony or the catastrophic toll it took on her failing organs. The child was eventually delivered, but the delivery came at a devastating cost. Margaret Theresa hemorrhaged, the blood loss rapid and unstoppable. The chamber filled with frantic movement, servants running for hot cloths, physicians shouting instructions, attendants trying desperately to keep her conscious. Leopold, waiting outside because tradition forbade his presence inside the birthing room, heard the rising panic and broke protocol, rushing to her side despite the gasps of those who witnessed his breach of custom. He found her barely conscious, her face ghostly white, her lips tinged blue. He knelt beside her, taking her hand in both of his, whispering her name, begging her to stay with him. She opened her eyes only briefly, looking at him with a kind of distant tenderness. She whispered something too soft for anyone else to hear. Some believed she said his name. Others believed she said, "Forgive me." No one ever knew for certain. Over the next 2 days, she developed puerperal fever. The infection spread rapidly through her weakened body, consuming her strength with terrifying speed. Her temperature soared. She shivered uncontrollably, then burned with heat, her mind clouded, drifting into delirium. She spoke to people who weren't there, called out for her dead children, mistook servants for her Spanish ladies in waiting, and sometimes stared into the distance as though she could see some vast, beckoning horizon that no one else could. Those who sat by her bedside described the final hours as unbearably quiet. The fever had taken nearly everything from her. Her breaths grew slower, then slower still. Leopold remained with her, refusing food, refusing sleep, refusing to leave, even when asked. He held her hand, long after she lacked the strength to hold his in return. On the afternoon of March 12 or the morning of March 13, records differ. Margaret Theresa exhaled one final, fragile breath and did not inhale again. She was 21 years old. Her death rippled through the court with a grief so profound that even her enemies spoke of her with reverence. Leopold was inconsolable. He shut himself away, canceled performances and audiences, and refused to remarry for an unprecedented length of time. Vienna mourned not only an empress, but a young woman whose life had been engulfed by forces she never had the power to resist. And in Spain, where her portrait still hung in the palace corridors, people whispered that the glowing child from Las Meninas had died before she ever truly had the chance to live, a princess sacrificed to a dynasty that had taken more from her than it ever gave. Margaret Theresa's life, when viewed from a distance, resembles a single fragile thread stretched across the vast tapestry of 17th century Europe, delicate, luminous, and tragically short. Yet up close, That thread reveals a complexity of sorrow, duty, and sacrifice that makes her story one of the most heartbreaking in the long lineage of the Habsburgs. She was born, lived, and died within a narrow corridor defined by genetic limitations, political ambition, and the crushing expectations of imperial survival. And when her brief life ended at 21, it was as though an entire chapter of Habsburg decline crystallized within her final breath. She entered the world in 1651, at a moment when the Spanish Empire was already showing unmistakable signs of collapse. The once dominant power that had commanded oceans and continents found itself beset by military defeats, economic ruin, and political instability. To her father, King Philip IV, she was a symbol of continuity, an heir who might steady the lineage after the death of her elder brother and the long list of tragedies that haunted the royal nursery. But even as the kingdom celebrated her birth, her fragile health whispered a truth the court refused to hear. She carried within her body the consequences of centuries of intermarriage. The Habsburgs believed purity preserved their power. In reality, it eroded it. Their family tree, twisted inward upon itself for generations, left children like Margaret Theresa with weakened immunity, slowed development, and constitutions unable to withstand the demands of royal life. Her beauty, so striking in Velázquez's portraits, masked the brittleness of her bones, the instability of her breathing, the chronic fevers that plagued her from infancy. She looked like a child of privilege, but she lived like a child of perpetual convalescence. As she grew, the political machinery around her tightened. Every choice was made with dynastic intent. Her education emphasized diplomacy, piety, and obedience. Her playtime was supervised, her clothing ceremonial, her public appearances calculated, and looming over all of it was the expectation that she would marry strategically, not for companionship, not for affection, but to bind together two weakening branches of a fading empire. In this world, her tears held no weight, her desires had no place. At 15, she was sent to Vienna to marry her uncle, Leopold I, an arrangement deemed essential to stabilizing the Habsburg succession. It was a union born not from love but from bloodline mathematics, the kind of marriage that treated genealogy like a ledger sheet. Yet within this unnatural arrangement grew a genuine affection. Leopold adored her, protected her as best he could, and mourned her in a way that astonished the imperial court. But even love could not counteract biology. The cold Austrian climate, the demands of imperial etiquette, and the relentless expectation that she produce heirs drained her with each passing year. Her pregnancies, 6 in total, between the ages of 15 and 21, functioned like blows against a structure already cracked. Each one left her weaker, paler, closer to collapse. Doctors warned again and again that her body was not suited for childbirth. The court ignored them. She miscarried, delivered frail infants, and buried her children before she had even healed from their births. Her 5th pregnancy nearly killed her. Her 6th did. When she died in childbirth in 1673, the tragedy felt not only personal, but symbolic. She embodied the Habsburg dilemma. A dynasty obsessed with preserving itself had created a generation too weak to sustain it. Her death was therefore more than the passing of a young woman. It was a quiet confession that the empire's foundations, political, economic, and biological, were crumbling. Leopold, devastated, shut himself away for weeks and delayed remarriage for longer than any emperor before him. Spain mourned her as the luminous child immortalized in Las Meninas, unaware that the glow in the painting concealed a lifetime of pain. Her legacy, when distilled to its essence, is a story of contradictions. She was cherished, yet controlled, beautiful yet sickly, powerful in title, yet powerless in fate. Her life demonstrates how royal splendor often coexisted with human suffering, how the demands of empire consumed those least able to bear them, and how the brightest symbols of monarchy were sometimes simply fragile children caught between forces far greater than themselves. To summarize Margaret Theresa's fate is to confront the brutal arithmetic of dynastic ambition. Born in 1651 into privilege shadowed by genetic weakness, celebrated as the luminous girl of a masterpiece, shaped by a court in decline, married at 15 to her uncle in a last attempt to preserve a bloodline, broken by 6 pregnancies in 6 years, dead at 21, her heart giving out during a final, catastrophic labor, remembered as both the symbol of Habsburg beauty and the victim of Habsburg decline. And behind all these facts stands a young woman who never wanted a crown, who never sought the burden placed upon her, who lived a life scripted by others, and who died fulfilling a role she was never physically capable of carrying. Her tragedy is not merely historical, it is human. Margaret Theresa's life was shaped long before she drew her first breath. She came into the world carrying the silent weight of decisions made generations before her, marriages designed to consolidate power, alliances forged through close bloodlines, and a dynastic philosophy that equated purity with stability. She was not simply a daughter or a princess. She was the latest link in a chain forged by political ambition and reinforced by a belief that the empire could be preserved only by tightening its grip around itself. In this way, Margaret Theresa's life was never a personal journey but a predetermined script written by forces that cared little for her fragility. From infancy, she existed within a structure that saw her not as a child to nurture, but as a strategic asset to be preserved, displayed, and eventually deployed. The court celebrated her beauty, often remarking on her luminous presence, the softness of her hair, the delicacy of her features. But these compliments were rarely expressions of affection, they were assessments of value. Every gesture, every portrait, every public appearance was filtered through the lens of what she represented, not who she was. Even her illnesses, which should have elicited concern, were quietly reframed as inconveniences to be managed, rather than signs of deeper fragility. The dynasty needed her to be strong, but her genetics ensured she could never be. The Habsburgs prided themselves on continuity through endogamy, believing that keeping bloodlines pure preserved legitimacy. In truth, it created a generation plagued by congenital weaknesses. Margaret Theresa's immune system was compromised, her growth stunted, her stamina limited. She was, in effect, the embodiment of a system collapsing on itself, a system that demanded more from each generation, even as it produced children increasingly unable to meet those demands. Her childhood, constrained by etiquette and ritual, did not allow her to grow into her own identity. She was trained from the beginning to prioritize the needs of the dynasty over the needs of her body. Virginity, piety, obedience, and the ability to serve as a living symbol were taught to her with the same rigor as languages or religious doctrine. Yet no part of her education prepared her for the physical suffering that awaited her, for the repeated pregnancies that would drain her life, or for the emotional isolation that came with living as an instrument of empire. When she was married to her uncle, Leopold I, the political logic was unmistakable. The Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs were dwindling. The bloodline was thinning. Succession crises loomed. The marriage was meant to repair fractures within the empire's lineage, restore unity, and produce heirs who could carry the dynasty forward. She was, in essence, the last attempt at salvation for a system that had already sown the seeds of its own downfall. And Margaret Theresa, raised to obey without question, stepped into her role with a quiet submission that masked a deep, unspoken sorrow. She did not protest, though she feared the marriage. She did not resist, though her health was declining. She did not question, though the obligations placed upon her were lethal. She carried the weight of empire because she had been taught that to do otherwise was unthinkable. What makes her story particularly tragic is not simply that she died young, but that she was never given the chance to live for herself. Every stage of her life was overshadowed by expectation. She was expected to uphold a fragile alliance, expected to produce heirs despite her weak constitution, expected to appear radiant in public even when she could barely stand, expected to conceal her suffering behind the rigid grace demanded of an empress. Her pregnancies became the clearest symbol of her loss of agency. She was physically unfit for childbirth. Every physician knew it. Every attendant saw it. Even Leopold feared it. Yet no one had the authority or the courage to protect her from the demands of the state. Her womb became a battlefield where political ambition tore through the remnants of her strength. Each child she carried pushed her closer to death, yet each failure to produce a healthy heir only intensified the pressure placed upon her. Her life illustrates, with painful clarity, how women in royal courts were often treated as expendable vessels, sacrificed not through violence, but through expectation. Their suffering, hidden behind layers of silk and ceremony, rarely entered the historical record. Margaret Theresa's tragedy, therefore, stands not as an isolated incident, but as a reflection of a broader reality, that countless young women of high birth lived and died within systems that valued their lineage more than their lives. What differentiates her story from many others, however, is the extent to which her suffering symbolized the greater decline of the Habsburgs themselves. Her frailty mirrored the weakening empire. Her repeated losses echoed Spain's repeated defeats. Her death at 21, after a final labor her body could not endure, reflected the dynasty's own inability to survive the structure it had built. In losing her, the empire lost not only a young empress, but a fragile hope, the belief that their lineage could continue without consequence. Ultimately, Margaret Theresa's life was defined by forces beyond her control. Biology, tradition, politics, and the weight of expectations she was too delicate to carry. She was a child born into a story already unfolding without her consent, a pawn in a game she never wanted to play, a young woman whose beauty became a mask that concealed a lifetime of struggle. And yet, despite all this, she left behind a legacy that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That power often rests upon the suffering of those who cannot resist. That beauty can coexist with unspeakable pain, and that behind every portrait of royal elegance may lie the quiet collapse of a life never allowed to be its own. For most of the world, Margaret Theresa lives not through diaries, letters, or personal testimonies, but through a single, iconic image: Las Meninas. Velázquez's masterpiece immortalized her as the radiant center of a luminous scene, the golden-haired infanta standing still as light itself, surrounded by attendants whose gazes converge toward her like worship. She is, within that canvas, the embodiment of youth, privilege, charm, and gentle promise. The painting became one of the most celebrated works of Western art, studied endlessly by scholars, admired by generations of viewers, and revered for the way it captures a fleeting moment of royal grace. Yet that grace is a deception not because the painter lied, but because the painting, like all portraits of power, tells only the story it was commissioned to tell. It cannot show what lay beneath the surface: the fragile lungs, the failing heart, the genetic exhaustion inherited from centuries of close-kin marriages. It cannot reveal the quiet panic that filled her childhood rooms each time she fell ill. It cannot record the whispered worries of her attendants or the heavy silences that followed each warning from the royal physicians. The painting freezes her in a moment of perfect childhood illusion, a moment she herself never truly inhabited. Velázquez painted light as truth, but even he could not paint the truth of her suffering. In Las Meninas, Margaret Theresa is the sun. In life, she was a candle burning too quickly. The contrast between image and reality is one of the most poignant aspects of her legacy. While the public saw a luminous princess, the court knew a girl who tired after standing for too long beneath the weight of brocade and jewels. While the world admired the richness of her dress, her attendants worried about the tightness of its bodice against her ribcage. While artists praised her porcelain complexion, her doctors feared what that pallor implied. She lived inside a contradiction, celebrated as a symbol of dynastic strength, while her body was quietly failing under the very practices meant to preserve that dynasty. And because portraiture was the primary tool of royal propaganda, her beauty became a political artifact. The Spanish court sent her portraits across Europe to advertise her suitability as a bride. Painters softened her features, enhanced her glow, and concealed any sign of weakness. These portraits were declarations that the Spanish Habsburgs were still powerful, still fertile, still capable of producing heirs worthy of thrones. Her image needed to convince foreign courts that the bloodline was steady, even as that same bloodline was quietly collapsing under its own history. To this day, the world sees these images before it sees her story. She appears healthy, confident, serene, but behind each portrait lies the shadow of a girl who rarely felt well enough to stand through the long sessions required for such paintings. Sometimes she fainted. Sometimes she needed to rest between sittings. Sometimes the painter had to adjust her posture to hide her trembling. But these truths were brushed away with each new stroke of pigment, leaving behind only an illusion of vitality. It is not exaggeration to say Margaret Theresa became a symbol of two opposing realities: the brilliance an empire wanted to display, and the decay it refused to acknowledge. Her likeness functioned as the empire's mask. Her life was its unspoken confession. Vienna, too, perpetuated that illusion. After her marriage, portraits of her circulated widely, portraying her as a youthful, hopeful empress destined to secure the future of the Holy Roman Empire. Artists painted her in silks and lace, her hands resting gracefully on velvet cushions, her eyes gazing softly forward as though contemplating a life of regal accomplishment. But the truth was harsher. Even as those portraits were being finished, she was already struggling to breathe in the cold Austrian air, already losing strength, already carrying the early toll of pregnancies she was never physically meant to endure. History's memory of Margaret Theresa, shaped through these carefully constructed images, has long been softer than the reality deserved. She is remembered as delicate, yes, but often in the romanticized sense of a fragile flower. What gets lost is the relentless suffering behind that fragility, the fear during each pregnancy, the grief of losing children faster than she could recover, the dread she carried into her final labor, when even her doctors believed she would not survive. Her beauty, immortalized in paint, became a kind of armor that concealed her humanity. And in this way, her story mirrors the story of many royal women celebrated for their faces, ignored for their suffering. But Las Meninas also gives us something deeper if we look carefully enough: the quiet loneliness in her eyes. Even as she stands at the center of the composition, surrounded by attendants and adored by her father and painter, there is a stillness in her expression that feels almost haunted. It is the look of a child who has already learned that she exists for others, not for herself. A child aware of her role before she understood her own desires. A child destined for a life she did not choose. Today, we study the painting as art, but we should also see it as a memorial, a reminder that behind the luminous brushwork stood a girl whose life was carved by forces she could never escape. The world remembers her radiance. History is only now beginning to remember her pain. Margaret Theresa's story closes not with triumph, power, or legacy, but with a quiet, devastating truth. She was a young woman who never owned her life. Every chapter of her existence was authored by others, by tradition, by dynasty, by the heavy machinery of empire. She was born into a fading bloodline that required her obedience, carried by expectations that weakened her body, and ultimately consumed by a destiny she was never strong enough to bear. Her childhood was shaped by genetic fragility, her adolescence by a marriage designed to preserve a fractured dynasty, and her short adulthood by pregnancies that drained the last remnants of her strength. She died at 21, not because she made a mistake, nor because fate struck unpredictably, but because she fulfilled exactly what was asked of her. And that is the tragedy. Her obedience was the cause of her suffering. Margaret Theresa never had the chance to become anything beyond what the empire demanded. She never explored her own wishes, never grew into her own voice, never experienced a life separate from duty. She lived within frames first, the literal frame of Velázquez's canvas, then the metaphorical frame of imperial expectations, and finally the inescapable frame of her failing health. In her final days, surrounded by courtiers who could not save her and physicians who could not understand the true scope of her decline, she became the embodiment of a system that sacrificed its daughters to preserve its own illusions. Her death was not merely a personal loss, but a symbolic ending. The Habsburg dream of purity and continuity had led them to the very brink of their own collapse. Her story endures for the same reason her portrait endures, because she forces us to look beyond surface beauty and question what it cost. Behind every luminous painting, behind every carefully curated royal image, there may be a life lived in quiet suffering. And behind every dynasty that speaks of glory, there are individuals whose private pain was hidden beneath the weight of crowns. Margaret Theresa leaves us with a final reminder that history is not only shaped by conquerors and kings, but also by the silent tragedies of young women whose lives were given away before they could begin. She died as an empress, yes, but more truthfully, she died as a girl who was never allowed to grow up.